Great. Welcome to this evening. My name's Carolyn Hendricks. I'm Associate Professor here at the Crawford School of Public Policy. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the forum tonight. Sorry about the delay. We're just waiting for Jill Shepherd, but we've just all done a podcast together. So she's in the building, but she may just be trying to find us. But in the meantime, I just wanted to tell you we're actually live streaming this event, which means that through Facebook you can actually watch this live. You're here, so you don't need that. But if you want to rewatch it or circulate it to others, there's a link that will be available on the event website that you can then show. So if there's people, particularly in rural, regional or remote Australia, that you think might be interested in this discussion, please send them the link. So I might go ahead and introduce the panel, and at some point Jill will walk in and she's going to facilitate the Q&A. So this afternoon or this evening we wanted to just each talk for very briefly for 5 minutes and then open it up to Q&A. So we wanted to get as much question and discussion going as possible. So what we might do is just move through the four of us and just present a few kind of brief comments about rural politics and public engagement and public participation in rural communities. So I'm going to start, firstly by introducing the panel. Welcome. So firstly we have Gabrielle Chan, who many of you may know. She's been a journalist for over 30 years and she currently works as a writer for The Guardian. She's had extensive experience in the press gallery, has also worked at ABC Radio, but first and foremost she's a resident of a rural community, and that's what brings us here tonight to discuss her recently released book, which is entitled Rusted Off: Why Country Australia is Fed Up, which was released in September this year. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to actually bring Gabrielle here to have a discussion about some of the issues that she raises in her book, along with some of the people in her broader rural community, and also to hear from people from outside of the community. So next we have Peter Holding, who's a third-generation farmer from southeast New South Wales. And he grows crops such as canola and wheat, and is also running sheep for wool. So Peter is on the board of directors of the advocacy organisation Farmers for Climate Action, which was founded in 2015. Yeah. So Peter brings with us, extensive experience of being in a rural community, but also what it takes to build an advocacy organisation in rural Australia. Next is myself, and I'll introduce myself when I come to talk. But I've become interested in, rural issues, particularly through my work with Dennis Ginnivan, as I've been studying the electorate of Indi and the community participation that they've been conducting in that electorate. And I'll say more about that when I talk. Next is Dennis Ginnivan, who's from Yakandanda, who many of you may have heard of. He convinces us it's a town and not a fruit. What was the other thing? Or an ice cream, vegetable. But Yakandanda is doing some really amazing things, and Dennis is in the centre of a lot of the community-driven change there, both in terms of community politics, political participation and representation, and also renewable energy. So there's some really exciting things going on in that region. Dennis is from the region and has worked in health policy, rehabilitation area, and currently runs an event organisation. And here we have Jill, our chair, which is great. Let me introduce Jill Shepherd, who's from the other side of campus. So Jill's many of you would know her from the media, great commentator, and she's a researcher of Australian politics, particularly opinion polling, and she is here to facilitate the discussion. So I might hand over now to Gabrielle to give her 5 minutes worth of inspiration.
Now, do you want to sit here, Carolyn?
No, unless you want to.
No.
Okay, this is like speed dating, 5 minutes. The book in 5 minutes. I obviously have been a journalist since the 80s, but I grew up in the city, had a very suburban upbringing, had no connections with country Australia. My father is a Singaporean migrant who came here to study in the 60s. Mum's Anglo-Celtic, and so absolutely no idea of what was happening in country Australia. Inconveniently fall in love with a farmer in the 90s. Father's horrified and says, "Haven't you seen Wake in Fright?" I say no. So from that moment of transition, I really had in the back of my head that I wanted to write about these two very different worlds that I saw. Obviously, when I moved to my little town of Harden Murrumburra, which is 90 minutes west of here, I was looking at it not just as a resident, but through the eyes of a political journalist. And I noticed obviously very different traits, in terms of politics, in terms of sense of place, in terms of policy issues, particularly education divide issues, health divide issues. And so I wanted to write about them. Cut to 2016, Brexit happens. The election of Donald Trump, and I thought those communities that voted for those things looked a lot like my own community. The themes I write around in the book, just very briefly, are number one, that I think a lot of rural communities are confused by their place now in Australia. Country people have been very much a part of the Australia's imagination, its idea of itself, and through the arguments from the 80s, from the Hawke-Keating government onwards around economic rationalism, that place has been shaken, and so that's making people pretty cranky. Number two is, I think, often where we can be let down by rural representation, but also let down by a lack of choice for political representatives, and I think that means that parties can often take us for granted. I'd write a fair bit in the book about social division within our own communities. I don't think it's all, everyone outside's fault. I think we have quite serious fractures in our own communities, and it worries me in a time of political disruption that can get worse and be taken advantage of. But the optimistic thing that I see is really communities moving ahead of government on policy issues, and Peter can talk to this a little more, and Carolyn and Dennis as well, obviously. So that's the book in a nutshell. I think that's about 5 minutes, isn't it? I'll pass Peter on.
Well, my name's Peter Holding and I live at Harden, just down the road from Gabby, as it turns out. Now, I've been on an interesting journey, I guess, culminating in my involvement with Farmers for Climate Action. I don't know if you know of that organisation, but it's basically we're helping farmers adapt to climate change, which has been an interesting topic. I started farming in the late 70s and we've been adapting since then. We went through the 82 drought 2 years after I started farming, and that was pretty hectic. And then we went through the 80s and the 21% interest rates and all the rest of it. So we're in a drought at the moment, and I guess my view of the world is that we've been slowly losing our resilience for many, many years. Farmers have adapted very quickly. They'll pick up a new idea as quick as the scientists or wherever it might come from is around. We're all waiting for drone technology and robots and all the rest of it. So as soon as they hit the market, they'll be bought. So I don't think there's any delay in that. I was concerned probably after the 98 frost, when we got hit in November with a frost that wiped the crops out, that something was changing rapidly. So I then got involved with a group, Climate Champions, and we went around the country looking at innovations on climate change, and I tried to learn about what was happening with global warming. And just as an aside, I find it interesting, we started off learning about global warming, which is all about the emissions and various things, and then it was a government-funded project. We weren't then allowed to talk about global warming anymore. We had to talk about climate change, and then after a couple of years of talking about climate change, it then became climate variability. And, so, and eventually we got sick of it, so we wrote a letter to the Victorian Liberal Party and told them to lift their game and do something about climate change. And we got our funding cut, as you tend to do if you upset the government. So anyway, well, then we thought, well, that's no good. We'll just do it ourselves. So we've all got together in the Blue Mountains with some really, really smart women that were able to organise these things. And we've gone from strength to strength. And it's just mind-boggling from my point of view is how much support is out there, financial and various other forms, but also it's about leadership. I find a lot of the debate in country areas about farmers not thinking climate change is a reality or don't want to face it. A lot of that's driven by fear, but it's also driven by a lack of leadership. I find when I go to meetings, if somebody stands up and says that you really have to start looking at it, you can convert quite a few people on the spot. So the idea that all rural people don't get it, I think is a long way from the truth. I think we're just on the verge of trying to change the system. I also think Gabby's right about the diversity in the community. It's very different, but most of them are concerned about their families and the gradual decay of their small country towns. So whilst they have different views and they'll quite often have different ideas about why that's happening, the fundamental desire is to make it work better, and I think with the right sort of leadership they can do that. And that's where I'm at, so I'll hand over.
And bang on 5 minutes. We're getting good at this. Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the Crawford School for putting this event on. I really do appreciate the opportunity. So my name's Dennis Ginnivan. I'm the president of a group called Voices for Indi, which is Indi is the name of a federal electorate in northeast Victoria, just over the river from Albury-Wodonga if you're heading south. And that's a group that was formed in 2012 around the sense that maybe the community ourselves, we have a responsibility to shape the politics and get involved and show our children how to best be as a citizen, and that includes being involved in the engagement, listening to other people, coming to common positions, working with your local representative, sort of be actively involved in democracy rather than like a bystander every 3 years or so. So that group formed and got seriously interested in community engagement, and we wrote a report that captured a lot of the issues and challenges and opportunities that people in our region could see, and that report was given to federal candidates in the 2013 federal election, and from that it led to an independent standing because we didn't feel as if anyone was actually listening to us, and the community supported a candidate to stand and who was successful in now twice having been elected as an independent representative, a community representative. That's Cathy McGowan. Some of you may be aware that she's our federal MP. So I think one of the things I just wanted to throw out, just to get a bit of discussion going from our point of view, is that I've always lived and worked in rural Australia. I'm a social worker by original profession. I've studied economics and mediation and agricultural economics. So I sort of tried to bridge the gap between the economics and the social and economic, paradigm polarity. My view is that rural people aren't conservative. I think there's a historic thing which sort of says, well, you must be because the person who got elected is a conservative person. So they're representing that end of the spectrum. So therefore, oh, shit, we must be because he or she is. So that's who we are. And it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling, kind of scenario where there's no challenge or no sense of engagement with that idea. And I think on many issues, rural people have actually been not having a go at urban as specifically, but there are some things where rural people have sort of shown a lot of leadership in, and I can talk further about renewable energy, refugee sanctuary, finding a way to actually work on, challenge the climate change issue. As Peter was saying, it's a real thing. It's not just some kind of academic thing or something that you can ideologically philosophise over and say, well, that's a right-wing or a left-wing idea. It's actually a real-world thing, and that'll challenge real people in their landscape. So encouraging people to have a voice is really a big part of what we've done. And I should say very briefly, I'm also involved with a group called Totally Renewable Yakandanda, which has its goal to get 100% renewable energy by 2022. And I reckon when I first started, I should say one of the best things about it is it's an intergenerational project. There's the young people, and I'm not one of them, you might guess, but one of the young people who have led it. And when they first started, they projected that vision, and I thought, oh, guys, I hope you don't get burnt by your own idealism. But I now firmly believe we will achieve it. So it's the idea of intergenerational cooperation. They've got lots of smarts, lots of capacity, and so do the older people have networks and capacity too. So bringing those together without actually taking over is one of the real skills, I think, of people in my generation, is to harness that vision and passion and not sort of dominate it, work together. Am I going for time?
Yeah, no,
you're 5 minutes.
A little bit.
So just to follow on from that a little bit further, then that community energy, Total Renewable Yakandanda is up to 50% solar rooftop uptake now, which is about the national average is about 17%. And we're continuing to roll out bulk purchase opportunities so where people in the community can, if they put their name on the list, we can actually go ahead to an outlet for solar energy panels and get the best purchase price, and get them also linked into a UB connectivity between all those households. So basically, the idea is, as much as possible, all energy generated within the town is not used by an individual house under this network, community microgrid they call it. Energy can be used by another house in the town, and then there's a retailer that will do the calculations to work out who owes what amount of money for the power that's been either generated or used. So there's a community endeavour, and I guess that has happened because government wasn't involved, or it just so coincides with that scenario. But we developed a partnership with a corporation, a community and a corporation. Like talk about speed dating. It's a bit like that because we needed to form a trusting relationship for them to achieve their objectives to get into the renewable energy market, and they us to help us achieve our community goal. So that's how we're working together. Government has seen it and started to see that there's some benefits of that model. Our federal member has actually proposed a total renewable Indi, which is, and spoken about that in Parliament to sort of to tell the national parliamentary body that is an idea that is possible. So community up is really where I'm coming from, and I just use that renewable energy as an example of how it can work with politics in a community that has a bit of a crack at things.
Now, do you want to have 5 minutes, Carol?
Yes, that's all right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jill.
You organised it.
Before, I forgot to show you the book. So this is Gabrielle's book, so come and have a look at it, or buy a copy, even better. I'll just put it on the table there. I just wanted to pick up on some threads that are sort of woven through here and open the discussion up. I guess one of the things, I've got sort of 5 brief points, but I wanted to sort of take some of these observations and lived experiences of politics and representation and democratic renewal and innovation sort of from this rural context and place it in the context of what's happening around the world. Because I think some of the sentiments, as Gabrielle mentioned, that are sort of expressed in her book, these really rich narratives of people in her community of feeling frustrated and disconnected from Canberra, from Parliament House, are being echoed all around the world. And surveys show that people feel that they're disconnected from the political elites. And that our representatives are out of touch with where we're at and unwilling to listen. There's this growing body of political research that bears this out. And the second point is, I guess, is that so while citizens might feel alienated or disconnected from that formal world, there's lots of informal ways citizens are engaging. So this idea that people are turning off politics is kind of a misdiagnosis, because there's actually quite a lot of politics happening, but it's small p, it's informal. A lot of it's online, but a lot of it's very practical, as Dennis has mentioned. But it might happen in the supermarket. We boycott products, we get on crowdfunding, we protest. These are all ways in which people are participating. We're just not joining members, we're not becoming members of political parties. So there's obviously this awash of opportunities for people to voice and express concerns. But I guess the challenge is that there's a bit of a growing disconnect between this informal world and then this formal world of our elected representatives live in, the bubble. And I think Gabrielle captures this disconnect really well in her book. The third point, I guess, is what do we do about this disconnect if we're in a world where people are increasingly cynical about politics? And I guess in contexts where there's growing distrust and growing inequality. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that's fueling the polarisation in the US. So some scholars of democratic reform sort of say, well, actually citizens don't really want to get engaged, they really don't like politics, and they'd probably just prefer to leave it all to the elites and the experts. But this kind of diagnosis is also misguided because it ignores a lot of research and experiences that we hear from people on this panel that actually communities are trying to step forward and change things themselves. And there's lots of experimental research that's being done in the US and in Australia that actually talk to citizens and ask them about how would a more engaged form of democracy work for you. And the things that come out of those experimental sort of research projects show that actually people are dissatisfied with politics as usual, but they want a more kind of non-partisan and participatory kind of politics. So then the question is, well, how would we realise that? What's that going to look like, And I guess a lot of the work in democracy reform has looked at institutional solutions to that, so opening political parties up, opening the policy process up by having lots of forums and being more inclusive. And I've been, I guess, working on that sort of stuff for a couple of decades, and I've come to kind of see that while these reforms may have their place, they often leave citizens very disempowered because they don't often result in concrete, substantive policy reform. So we involve people, we engage them, but often citizens are left disempowered. So that's why I've become quite interested in these, I guess, bottom-up forms of democratic reform, and the Voices for Indo has been something I've been really interested in. And there's evidence all around the world, in Spain and other places, where citizens are sort of forming parties, etc., themselves. But one of the things I wanted just to open up, and this is my fifth point, which taps into the renewable energy project that Dennis just mentioned, and Gabby's got lots in her book as well of examples of citizens actually recognising that there are policy problems that we want to solve, let's just get on and do it, with or without government. And you see this in the healthcare sector, the aged care sector, the energy, renewable sector, education sector. So there are lots of examples of these citizen-led innovations, governance innovations happening all around the world. And Australia is also a site of these. You might hear them under the label of civic enterprises, community cooperatives, etc. I call them doing publics. These are very practical, on-the-ground, problem-solving initiatives where citizens actually just get on and do the solving. I think these are really interesting and innovative spaces, both for democracy but also for public policy. But they also present some challenges. Let me just put a few out there and then we can open it up. one of the challenges is really, what does it mean if our public policy system is moving to these very piecemeal, sort of citizen-driven approaches to energy, for example? So community energy is a great initiative and it brings people in, but it also risks undermining the entire grid. We have a very centralised energy system. What happens if everyone goes off-grid? So there are big public policy questions and real practical questions. And then there's questions around accountability. So how do we, if a lot of public policy is going to be sort of offloaded onto the citizen, which suits the neoliberal sort of idea, but what happens, if those citizens aren't inclusive of the broader community? What if they're not thinking about social and inequality issues? So these are some of the things, I guess, that I'm interested in opening up in my research and with the audience. So I'll hand it over to Jules.
Yep, and I'm going to absolutely take my prerogative to ask the first question. Because Caroline and I study very, very similar sort of phenomena, but from a very different perspective, that I'm interested in big P politics, right? I don't think we're going to get rid of political parties, unfortunately. So my first question is to everyone, and I think I just sort of a very quick answer from you, from all of you. What would a good representative national based rural party look like? With this idea that, and that I think Dennis sort of took the words out of my mouth and made them much more articulate, but that we think rural areas are conservative. But some of the stuff that you've talked about, and I wonder too, how representative do you both feel, or I guess, and you as well, Gabby, but Peter and Dennis, how representative do you feel of your communities in terms of ideology, but that's such a big P politics term too. But are farmers really talking about sliding scale pricing for renewable energy? These sort of really progressive ideas that are almost too progressive nationally. The Labor Party wouldn't touch these, right? In some ways so progressive, in other ways probably still quite conservative, or at least is that just our misperception of what communities are in these rural areas? So what kind of party do the four of you think would capture that awful kind of, not tension, but, a lot of contradictions?
I would say that the party would be centrist for rural Australia. So rural Australia tends to be kind of more economic interventionist, in my view. I mean, where we hate regulation and red tape until we want it. So I think the policy platform would be centrist, and it would draw infrastructure projects, for example, that have come out of regional development areas, but it would also have connectivity policies, around, I think the first version of the NBN would have, every country person would have loved. On climate change, I slightly disagree with Pete on this, that, I think culturally, because of the way traditionally country areas have voted, it became, impossible to talk about climate change post-2013 when Abbott was talking about ending the carbon tax, because to agree with climate change for a lot of people was tantamount to voting Labor, and you would just never do that in some country circles, right? So you wouldn't talk about it. I think it's become more of an issue now. So, it would be a centrist party. I would have the coalition, the version of the coalition agreement absolutely transparent and on the table, so that everyone could see, what, as an MP,
you'd sign up for.
You'd sign. Why wouldn't you sell your policies? It makes no sense. I think it would be dead in the middle.
Well, I'm disappointed to hear that Gabby doesn't agree about something. I suppose I shouldn't. I just never expected that to happen. No, seriously. Look, I'm a bit over parties. I think the problem we've got is that the parties have been controlled from central head office, or whatever you like to call it, and even the members that are in those parties have very little say in what the policy is. So for me, I'd like to see the communities in each electorate come together and select good independents. I think the Parliament would be improved dramatically if people from all walks of life were elected instead of just political staffers and lawyers. I think there's a lot of people out there with a lot of world experience. I'd like to see Parliament in a more of a classical sense, I guess, debate issues and come up with the policies. I don't know whether that's too utopian, but yeah. I'm just a social anarchist, you know how it is. But look, I think it's happening. I think I'm pretty normal for a rural type person. We have debates about immigration and racism and all these sorts of things, and I'm probably pretty much on the left of that. But I don't think that's because people actually believe that. I think it's fear. I think they worry about. They know that their businesses and their jobs are under threat, and so they worry about it naturally. And then they see other people coming to town. Doesn't really matter where they come from. They could be Australians from, Redfern or somewhere, and there'd be the same sort of attitude. It's the outsider versus the insider, and that's just a knowledge thing. That's just an understanding that has to be accommodated and worked on. But I think if the community comes together and work, like I run a land care group, and I've set it up in the 1990s, and green is the next best thing to I don't know what, but you didn't want to be one, I'm pretty much assure you. We set that group up. We covered the whole Shire. It's been going for 25 years. We've held it together. People have vastly different opinions about things, but we just agree to disagree and get on with whatever the project is and do things. I think you learn in rural Australia how to cooperate. I mean, I've always been of the belief that mateship is a thing that's peculiar to inland Australia, in the sense that you have to be a mate. You're not going to live very long out here if you don't have a mate, and you don't have to like that mate. You might even hate him, but you're still going to have to get on with him. So that's sort of where I come from. They try and make it into some miraculous thing. I think there's too much myth also in Australia. I think Australians, whether they live in Western Sydney or whether they live in rural Australia, are very much the same. They're worried about their jobs and the cost of living and housing and all the rest of it. I think that we're extremely poorly led when our leaders stand up and carry on with all the dog whistling that they do. I think that is just, it's what I hate in politics the most. It just drives me to distraction that people they seem to set disadvantaged people against disadvantaged people while they float around at the top with all the goodies. But and for whatever the reason is, the disadvantaged people are happy to attack other disadvantaged people. They don't seem to realise that they're being used, and that's been that way since feudalism, or 10,000 years ago. We've just got to get smarter and realise that we're all in the same sticky wicket, and start working together.
But Caroline, this idea of identity versus identity is central to politics, right? How would we study it if we weren't all fighting?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think that we'll get rid of parties, but I think there's lots of very interesting, innovative, both community-driven, but also technological kind of advances and experimentation going on in these rural and regional communities, and there always has been. But I think there's lots of things we can learn for democratic renewal in those kinds of places, and I think there's lessons in there from what Cathy McGowan does about how she runs her participatory sort of constituency relationships that parties could learn, and they are opening up, trying to do more participatory work. And I guess just, even in the New South Wales recent by-election, there was lots of conversations about politicians getting real. I mean, that's something across the board. Whether that means wearing jeans or actually talking to people and listening is a kind of, but there is this desire, whether people are talking to party politicians or independents, that they want better, integrity, ethics, and I guess to be listened to. And these are some themes I think that parties of all sides of the spectrum and independents can take from these lessons or sites of renewal in Australia.
I think A party that represents like a rural, rural Australia is really what we're, how it'll look in the future. That was you said, Jill. That what we're
Yeah,
asking.
what would it look like?
Yeah, so I think the numbers are that there's 100,000 farmers and there's 4.9 million non-farmers in rural Australia. Now, you can draw lines all around provincial cities or non-capitals and all of that, but the idea though of rural Australia being stereotyped, and I know we were speaking about this before. Peter said that Gabby said that the farm group have actually been quite strong in where rural is identified with the farmer. But if a politician, if a party that represents all those people in some other configuration, then to me that'd be one attribute. And also I think the other one is that what we're learning through some of this community capacity to have a go themselves, to me maybe the relationship between community and government is changing to one where a party or a government enables creativity and passion and energy to do things, to flourish, rather than wait for government to design a program that rolls out across a homogenised, kind of a program that rolls out across an issue. So, and then the government can look for, well, how can we best work with that energy in rural Australia rather than just wait for everyone to wait. So to me, there'll be some of the things that the party would look like or be doing in a future world.
There's that really interesting tension between interventionist economic policy, but also just back off and let us. We'll open up to questions. I can bring the microphone up, or if you're just willing to talk very loudly, that would be preferable. I will start at the front. Need to get the microphone. I was going to stay sitting down. No, you sit. Okay, we're going to start here.
Okay. What I would like to see is not a country party or a city party. I would like to see a climate party, because that is what unites us all. It's hard to get country people to vote for Greens, the most overt environmentalists, because the Greens have other agendas that seem to be anti-animal agriculture and sports and whatever. So it's a bit hard, you say to country people, vote for the Greens, but perhaps an independent is a better course in some situations. But what really binds us all, we're all on the same sinking ship, and we need an environment movement party. And I'm sorry, I've got the shirt on. I've got a Frontline Action on Coal shirt, and that is what binds country people and city people to me, because we know we need to shut down the export coal and gas industries. And that's another people's movement. We can do it directly.
I think that's really interesting that there is, if it's fracking or if it's climate change or if it's export coal. So I think what Peter's saying is that he's going to run for. He's going to run in.
It's quite interesting. In Farmers for Climate Action, before we set the group up in the last 10 years, it was quite difficult, and you could get held down quite a bit. But since we've been going, and we've basically taken the philosophy of trying to provide knowledge and ideas on how farmers can adapt to climate change or global warming. So I prefer to go back to the start, because that's what we know, and climate change is climate in different parts of the world. But I think what we're finding is that people come up to us all the time and say, can you guys form a party? Well, no, we can't. It's against the law, because we're a charitable organisation, so that would be out. But I don't think we have all the answers either. I mean, I think what we would like to see happen is we'll provide some information, people will discuss it, digest it, disagree or whatever. I mean, it's like with the comments about the Greens. The Greens have quite a lot that could help rural Australia, but they keep shooting themselves in the foot, because they have this and a lot of Australians do, that rural Australia is is a really simple place. And, you know, anybody could be a farmer. We can all grow carrots in our backyard, so it can't be that hard to grow 10,000 acres of it. So it's very, very complicated, and it's getting more complicated with climate change. And you know, the idea that we'll get rid of livestock and turn it into crops, I mean, people not understand different soil types and you know, the fact that most animals run on arid country which you can't grow crops on. That's why they're in Africa and in western New South Wales. You know, the good country or the Liverpool plains, they grow crops on, yes. So there's a whole lot of variety in the world, and I think we need to understand that it's a very complex place. I think we need to stop being intimidated as individuals about the fact that we don't know things. I mean, I don't know so much, it's ridiculous, but you know, that doesn't worry me. You know, if somebody comes up and sets me straight, that's good. You know, I might learn something. I've learned lots of things today. But I think everybody has the right to have a view. They have a family that they want to protect. And we just need to start realising that we're all pretty much very similar and start working together.
I'm going to steal the mic back off you. Did you have something to say then, Dex?
Well, my experience is that rural people know what's happening around them, and they can see the broader trend line, and I don't think they really sort of see it as like an issue that should be polarised or in ideological sort of terms. So, you know, if you think it's not happening, then you vote one way. If you think it is happening, you vote another way. I don't think rural people generally, and maybe they're more exposed to the actual reality of this as opposed to what people are just positing from an ideological perspective. So I think that's a core part of all this, and when it comes to rural people, is that they are living in an environment day to day that is shaping what's happening, as Peter was saying. So in answer to your query, can be like an environmental party or somehow where environment and issues like this get treatment, then to me, I just don't know why this issue has become the ideological polarity when it could have been, you know, cheese, or it could have been roads. But for some reason, it's the one that everyone's dying in the ditch over to differentiate. And I don't know, I think country people, and I think maybe it's related to what Gabriel's saying, I sense it is, that country people don't see it that way. They don't see it as something left or right.
Think of people actually putting themselves, blocking fossil fuel projects. You know, they will lay, country people will lay their lives on the line to stop this.
All right, we're going to go up the back.
Thanks.
That's okay.
Hi everyone. I'd like to ask some questions about the social process. And I came in 15 minutes in, so I'm sincerely apologetic if you talked about this and I missed it. But what does it take? Dennis, I've heard part of your story and I'd love to hear you elaborate on this a little bit more and everyone else's perspectives too. What does it take to make that change from someone who's a passive participant in civil life, where you might place a vote on voting day, to becoming empowered and taking on that role of being the agent of change? I'd really like to hear about that. Is it an identity change, an ideology change? Do you have the curtain ripped away and you see how society works? Thank you.
So I think it's often a single issue that affects you personally that gets you involved in the process. I give an example in the book where there was a development threat in our area to a number of the farmers, and that changed the whole kind of dynamic in that group, and those social divisions I talk about in country towns where you have kind of rural farmers versus townies, or, you know, sectarian divides, whatever the divides are. That completely opened up a conversation between farmers and Indigenous people in the town, and it has brought about a reconciliation process by learning more about the land, learning more about the heritage, not just Indigenous heritage, but you know, Chinese mining heritage, European farming heritage. And that has opened up a whole conversation now at a time when literally the same time when the Uluru Statement from the Heart came about, and Malcolm Turnbull dismissed it in 24 hours. So that actually changed the conversation, not just on reconciliation, but on other things, because it brought people together that weren't actually talking prior to that. And I think so often it's a single issue that opens you up to something. Climate change during times of drought has opened up a lot of people, I think, to think about issues in different ways. And it just needs that one foot in the door to open the crack on that sort of thing.
Which of you guys, these two, are going to fight for who asks the question?
I've just my question's focused on state farming organisations and farmer representative groups. I mean, it's probably one demographic that's got more options of these groups to join that do have. I mean, at one time, look at the power that the National Farmers Federation had. So we're talking about parties and things like that. Why are we seeing declining memberships, do you think? Because a lot of these groups are actually working for benefits that do flow on past the farm gate to rural communities. Why are we seeing the decrease in the memberships, which flow-on effects are decreased funding and therefore the money to be able to do advocacy on their part?
Well, interestingly enough, I've spent most of the day at the NFF discussing drought policy, but I think it's because there's a lack of communication and a lack of connection in many cases. I think what those organisations really need to do is to, and I notice the NFF has Fiona Simpson leading it now, which I think is a huge step in the right direction. I think they became moribund and sort of full of old men. There was a certain vested interest. I mean, agriculture is not, let's say it's not classless. There's a large, I find agriculture at times to be awfully sort of arrogant and uncaring about other farmers. And so you've got all sorts of farmers. You've got corporates. You've got multi-generational large farms. You've got a whole huge number of soldier settler farms, or their families now, from after the First World War and Second World War. You've got all sorts of people in agriculture, and it was kind of dominated by the landed gentry, for want of a better word. 20, 30, 40 years ago, you had to be a certain type of person to be in the New South Wales Farmers, or to lead it. The rest of us could all go along and participate. I haven't been a member of New South Wales Farmers for a very long time because I just couldn't follow their policy making. You'd go to meetings and they'd vote one way, and then 5 minutes later they'd vote another way, just to settle an argument between another group. It was kind of irrelevant. So I think that's why people have dropped off. But they're still looking for some way of connecting. I don't think they've given up trying to connect. They've lost an understanding of how to do that. I mean, I think leadership, I was going to say on the previous question about the role of leadership, I've fallen into this pretty much accidentally. I was asked in 1989 to set up a land care group, which I had no intention of doing. And I actually told the guy, I said, that'd be a waste of time. Anyway, I thought, oh yeah, rightio, we'll go ahead and do it. And so we did it, and we didn't know what we were doing. But that led to other organisations, and then we started working with CSIRO and State Land Care, Decade of Land Care. And you learn over time. Like I've had good mentors. I've had people that have shown me how to do things. And you just keep learning. And I think the trick really is to get some of the new people and mentor them and encourage them to come back to the communities that they used to live in and try and bring jobs back. I think the internet is helping because it's allowing people to come back into the bush and work from home. There's a lot of things that are changing, but I think leadership is something we've got to... And it's not... I fight bushfires in my spare time. I'm a group officer. And it's a bit emotional because it's quite dangerous, but it's not something that you just know how to do. It's something that you learn, and you have to learn how to send people into dangerous situations and hope they'll come out. So you have to be mentored, and I think sending people off to Parliament House, for argument's sake, I see so many people go to Parliament House and they're intimidated by the politicians. You know, they're really, you know, they go in there to make a point, and the politician will tell them that they don't know what they're talking about, or they're mistaken, or, you know, this is not how it works. And they'll be so in awe of that politician because they've never dealt with them before that they'll leave it at that and walk out and they'll go, what happened there? I didn't understand that. But once they get some empowerment behind them and they get a community behind them, they become feral. They're like piranhas, you know.
I think you touched on something really important, Peter, and it's that you got asked to start the land care group.
Yes, somebody has to mentor you. Somebody has to...
We're going to go to the next question, though.
Thanks. Mine probably follows on a little bit from Ash's, but it's to sort of explore what Dennis has been doing as well. I just wanted to find out, you talk about the community endeavours and the totally renewable yak and dander that you've been involved in. Do you think... Oh, yep. Yep. So I was just going to ask, there's obviously initiatives like this happening in many towns across Australia. Do you think it's hard to get engaged with those other community endeavours to find out what their challenges and their learnings have been, and then to come together as a group to sort of amplify that message so that you can start to have an impact on policy around government providing more ability for communities to be more creative and provide their own solutions?
Yep. Thanks, great question. As you're asking that, it reminded me of a point that Gabrielle made in the book, just a plug, but she made the point about, we use the analogy of Tesla cars. So each car learns things each day, and at the end of the day, it uploads what it's learnt to the collective of all the other cars, like, you know, road surface, braking, weather. And what she was suggesting to me, a subsequent conversation, and I think in that book, in that part of the book, was to what extent can one community upload quickly from another and not go through the whole thing all over again and form the committee and work out, you know, the minutes and all that sort of stuff to actually quickly scale up. And, you know, I guess that's been happening since the year dot in some ways, but certainly in our region, for example, in addition to totally renewable yak and dander, there's now about 20 groups in other towns within the same region that have got some renewable energy focus and endeavour. And so there's been projected this idea of a totally renewable Indi, which is the collective. And it can be the political collective as well as the renewable energy collective to represent to our federal member a view that would pretty much be in common, so then the federal member can actually state the position when representing that issue in our region in Parliament. So that's one way in which you can and that's happening. There is a document that captures the idea of a totally renewable Indi, and there's a network of organisations like this within our own region that are meeting regularly to develop points of commonality, so that there's sort of like a sense of if this region can speak with one voice on this issue, then let's try to get to that, because otherwise the average MP probably has 10 conflicting positions on all sorts of things, and who do you represent and who are you prepared to take the heat from the following day if you don't represent the other 9. You know, so we've got to have the back of the politician to some extent to make these sort of things happen.
It's a grim reality. It's a grim reality that we have to rely on politicians at the end of the day, right? We're going to squeeze in 2 last questions.
Hi, thanks so much for such a range of really diverse and interesting insights. Gabrielle, you touched on this in your book, the idea of voters becoming kind of rebellious or unreliable. So I was recently in Myrtleford, which is also in Indi, and the people I spoke to referred to this strategy quite explicitly, that they were going to become unreliable voters, that they were being taken for granted, and that was going to be an effective strategy to bring resources to rural areas and get that attention that, as you so aptly described, they've been lacking. I was wondering if you could comment on that more generally for the different areas you are involved in, and whether you see that as kind of an adaptive measure or is it somehow destructive? And I think, Carolyn, you've touched on those two aspects of the micro and the macro adaptations. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say that is becoming a very common theme, and a lot of the conversations I had with people on my main street was all about, we want to make this marginal, and you can see it. At Guardian, we track where the leaders go at every election, and it's always to the marginal seats. I'm surprised it's taken so long for people to cotton on to this fact. So there's that make it marginal idea. But also I think the other thing that I'm seeing in rural areas is the reluctant politician. So the reluctant independent, and often they're women, and often they're women of a certain age, who have had enough of trying to go through the advocacy groups that you talked about, that are really hidebound in either old boys networks or that are nurseries for politics, so no one wants to step out of what the key messages of the party that they're going to be. Women, particularly women's leadership that has been nurtured through capacity building over the last decade, is driving new ways of doing politics. And so what I'm hearing more often now, apart from the make it marginal, is somebody's got to do something. And I'm not politically ambitious. This is what people are telling me. I'm not politically ambitious, but I can't stand by any longer and watch this stuff happen. And so if it's not me, it's got to be someone. And if I can't find someone, it'll have to be me. And Jane Caro talked about that, not just obviously in rural areas, but she described that in a recent Saturday paper piece. So the other point I would make about the make it marginal idea is this, sometimes we're seeing protest votes where people just go, I just want to smash the machine and get rid of the incumbent. And I would like to see some more discussion around what is it? Is it possible that we could make this worse by making seats, by tipping incumbents out at any cost? Often, or not often, but sometimes the alternative could be worse. And so I think voters also need to be having discussions around this. Is it anything but, or is it, good kind of sensible politicians who have the constituents at heart?
And we'll go to the last question.
Sorry, Gabrielle, this question's sort of for you as well, but I'm sure the other panellists will have some views. I grew up on a sheep station in the northeast pastoral of South Australia, and I've definitely noticed, having gone back there a lot as I've grown up, the sort of vastly diminished size of the community, and obviously a lot of people, including federal politicians, are sort of lamenting the loss of a lot of Australian rural communities. But then on the other side of things, you've got a lot of economic analysis which sort of talks about how it's more sort of economically inefficient to artificially kind of bolster rural communities, and urbanisation is actually macroeconomically more beneficial to society. Earlier you talked about that sort of perfect rural party. How do you think that rural party would advocate for the regions, given the sort of evidence versus the way that people actually feel in the regions?
Well, I think, I've got a chapter in there on decentralisation. I was racking my brains to think of another word for decentralisation because it's got such a bad reputation, and I had such debates with, among others, John Daly of the Grattan Institute. I mean, partly it's like, you don't disregard your own citizens, right? So, you know, Tony Abbott's very inflammatory comments about Indigenous communities, you know, making this lifestyle choice, you know, were kind of really sat everyone back and thought, well, is the fact that I'm living in a regional area a lifestyle choice for me too? I just don't think it's sustainable to keep packing people in cities forever. And so if you buy into the pact that you know, we value Australians equally, then something has to go out there. Something has to happen in places where people choose to live, right? At the same time, I think country communities have to acknowledge that our services are more expensive and that per head we get more in terms of funding per capita than people in cities. I think it ranges from $22 a head in a city to, you know, 3,000 something in a remote community. So we have to acknowledge that, as I say in the book, that we are more than the sum of our grants, you know, and that we can't expect governments to do everything. So I think it's a simple kind of citizenship argument that says, you know, do we really, I think the projections are the ABS are 8 million people for Sydney and Melbourne by 2050. How is that going to work there? And instead of arguing from our perspective as rural citizens, you know, woe is me, keep throwing money at me, it's what I see now is a kind of gentrification happening and arguments around food and place and, you know, actually come here because it's a great place to live. Notwithstanding all of the issues, it's actually a really nice place to live, and we're going to provide a safety net and we're going to provide community. And I think it has to be argued from that glass half full perspective, rather than what often rural MPs do is try and leverage what I call the sad songs of country communities, the constant talk about decline and not seeing the good stuff as well.
We might all finish with a sort of final comment.
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say I think we've been led astray with this neoliberal sort of economics. I read a bit of Ross Gittins and Joseph Stiglitz, and
Just like normal farmers.
just like normal farmers, and I have to.
Ross loves a good troll.
Yeah. But I mean, like he's talking about measuring economic growth by other factors other than GDP, and I think we have to start doing that. I think, you know, there's lots of. Well, I wouldn't move to the city if you paid me. I just couldn't stand it. And it is pretty good life out in the country. You know, we do get more services, but we're happy to share them if anybody wants to come out. So anybody wants to move, there's plenty of places.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say one quick thing that sort of struck me as Dennis was talking, and we had these questions about the Farmers Federation and you know, why are membership dropping, and I guess we've talked a lot about political parties and how they might reform, but I think what we're seeing, particularly with these sort of more entrepreneurial and kind of creative and innovative spaces, is that citizens are kind of they're over the adversarial nature of both parties and lobby groups, interest groups, sort of classic organisations, which are singular, which are kind of adversarial. And I guess when you contrast that with what Dennis was saying about, you know, the Tesla model, which is about sharing, learning, it's nuanced, it's involved. So it's a really different way of kind of connecting. And I think that a lot of this is a new way of also thinking about civil society, I think.
And Beck, I was just going to follow up what I was thinking before. I wanted to answer your question too, but I'll just use a very quick example. When we did our kitchen table, you were asking about like the psychology, what gets people motivated, or what triggers the change. So we had this kitchen table conversation. You go around to someone's house, there'd be 10 people there. One person would facilitate it, and one person would be the scribe, and there'd be 10 people all participating in the conversation. Anyway, there was one guy there who was sort of sitting there with his arms folded like this and, you know, looking like that, and I was using my deep analysis of body language to work out that he didn't want to be there, or someone else, maybe his wife, told him he should be. So anyway, he was there, and the deal was you go around the room, you quickly ask each person, well, what do you think about, what do you like about living here? What are the challenges? What do you think we can do about things? How do you think of being represented? All those sort of questions. But I got to one question where Michael asked, well, what do you say, Michael? And so he went on about quite a bit about some of the things that he felt were really important and really sort of making him cranky about where he lives. And so my job was to summarise. So, Michael, you've just said, so I was here after about 3 or 4 minutes, but I said, Michael, you've said A, B, C and D, E, F, G and H, H, I, J and K. Is that right? And he was shocked because, he was genuinely shocked. I don't mean to say just to hype it up here, but because he said, no one's ever listened to me before. And I said, well, not only that, Michael, but it's already in the scribe has already captured what you've just said, and that's going into the report. That's going to go to all the candidates in the next federal election. So all of a sudden he started to think, gee, I'm glad I came here. Because he did feel that was the trigger, I think, that he worked out that most people go, yada, 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 yada. I can't wait for someone else to stop talking because I've got all the answers. And that's what he's pushing up against was he's sort of sick of that. So that's another aspect of this triggering change is actually getting people ensure that people are respected, there's courtesy, there's engagement and invitation to be part of it. A lot of people don't get that in their life, that sort of sense of community. So I just use that as another example to finish off
it's
my
a
bit.
great note to finish on. Do you want to thank everyone, Carolyn? Or I would love to extend a massive thank you to Carolyn Hendricks for organising tonight and for everyone else for travelling here. Dennis has come from Indi. You guys have come from 90 minutes down the road. I've come from Lynham, which was an awful stretch. But thank you to Carolyn in particular for bringing this amazing group together and everyone for providing such sort of interesting and I think stimulating, hopefully, engaging thoughts. So thank you.